It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Roger Connor, who's the director of Vanderbilt Law School's Advocacy Project. And this is an interdisciplinary effort involving research, teaching, and training on advocacy for public policy change. Professor Connor earned his BA degree at Oberlin and his JD degree at the University of Michigan. And for the past 3 decades, he's served as a lobbyist, lawyer, organizer, social entrepreneur, and facilitator of multi-party conflict resolution processes and publishing articles on many of these topics. We're really pleased that he's willing to share his insights and his expertise with us today as he discusses the challenges of transition and how we can effectively deal with the challenges that they entail. So anyway,
there we go. There you go. Thank you. I have endured a fair number of changes in my life because first I went from Texas to Oberlin. That was a big change. For those of you who are familiar, Oberlin is a small liberal arts college. It was the end of the Underground Railway and the first college to be both co-ed and integrated in the United States. Texas was different than Oberlin. Then I went to law school, and then I basically had about 7 different careers. What I would do is get involved in an issue, go and form an organization, or join an organization and start a new program in that organization, raise money, do that for 5 to 7 to 10 years, and then move on to another one. So each time I had to basically go back and start over. So I would run an immigration group, and then I would start a group on public safety, and then I would start a group on conflict resolution. So I've had a fair amount of experience with what happens when you go through a significant change. But recently what's happened is that my most recent work that I've been doing involves working with foster care agencies in the U.S. And foster care agencies deal with both line staff and young people who are really going through major changes in their life because they've been removed from their homes, placed in foster homes, in many instances, moved from home to home, and finally, if they're not adopted, they actually have to make the change from being in high school to graduating and no longer having a foster home without parents. So put yourself, if you can, back in the place you were at when you went from high school to college and imagine not having a family. That's what they're going through. So in order to do this, I've studied quite a bit about what happens with us when we have to go through change. So in order to get us started, I've made a little sheet on the top. So look at that top sheet. What I want you to do is just look at the top sheet and think about not just yourself, but your friends. How frequently are you hearing either yourself, you're thinking some of these things or acting in these ways, or you are observing or hearing other friends of yours who are having the same reaction? For example, you're drinking more coffee, or you have friends who are like slugging it down all the time that didn't before. That's on my list. So just take the list and quickly go down and check some boxes to sort of give you a little bit of an idea of some of the reactions that we observe when people have to go through a significant life change, like coming to law school, or like going from law school into the legal profession, or like going from one job to another in the legal profession. So just run down, check those that either you think might apply to you or that you've heard some of your friends expressing or acting out in those ways. For our people that might watch this as a podcast, I'll put this up on the screen, and I think Julie will arrange it so maybe this set of pages can be downloaded maybe from your website for anyone who wasn't here. So this is brainstorming. Be really quick. Go down just as fast as you can. Check some boxes. While you're doing that, I can tell you my most recent change was going from a job in Washington, D.C., where I had a large staff and I was facilitating consensus-seeking processes on things like medical care and the President's faith-based initiative with the Washington director of the Office of the ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State. In other words, I was an important person by my own account. And to come to Vanderbilt to be an adjunct professor, and when my wife was hired here, and to start a new project from scratch. So that's, and I can tell you that some of those things on that sheet, such as ideation about what have I done, what have I given up in order to come here, am I going to be able to find a foothold, doubts of my own capabilities, worries, all of those things, including the caffeine intake, all present. So what we're going to be talking about is when students come to law school, or when they go from law school to work that first job, we observe there are lots of studies out there. I went through a few of them today. One study says 40% of law students report signs of clinical depression. And I went back in preparation for today about 6 studies. And the studies, and by the way, these range from Uganda to U.S. The studies in general, the range of reports of significant emotional disturbances as measured by mental health professionals. The lower bound is about 27.5%. The upper bound is about 50%. And all of the studies that have been done are in this range. These are all studies of students. There's an interesting factoid that I want to share with you. Studies are not just about law students. They're about students. Turns out that 30 to 40% of undergraduates, when they get to undergraduate school, report signs of depression and emotional disturbance. 50% of medical graduate students report the same things. Over 30% of graduate students report the same thing. So I don't want to take away the idea from you, the idea that law school and the legal profession have some unique stresses. But there's something else going on here in addition to what the law school, what the profession does. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Exodus story, but if you go back and look at that biblical tale, the people of Israel were in Egypt, and they were in slavery, and life was pretty miserable. Moses came along and said, I've got a way out of this. Follow me. And as the biblical tale goes, people were saying, way cool, this is going to solve all of our problems because we're getting away from Egypt. So a bunch of bad things happened to the Egyptians, and the Egyptian Pharaoh finally said, okay, go. And the people of Israel cross the Red Sea. Both symbolic and actual, they can't go back. That was the change. Now, the biblical account says the very first thing that happened, you'd think they would have been celebrating the end of slavery. Not correct. The first thing that happened, they said, what is this? At least we had houses in Egypt. At least we had food. We're out here in the desert. How are we going to eat? The response to that change was anger, resentment, and fear. And it was all connected to what they had lost. Despite how terrible life was when they went through the change, the emotional, psychological response had to do with the losses. And those responses were anger, frustration, fear, which they directed at Moses because there weren't any Egyptians around to project it onto. And they projected it on each other. Now, as if that weren't bad enough, the biblical account says God provided them with food and with shelter, with light at night, guarding. They were now safe and they were well fed. They're also lost. And they wandered around, as the biblical account says, for 40 years. That's a long time. But it was 40 years of confusion and uncertainty. They knew they weren't in Egypt, and they had no idea what it would feel like to be in a new place. Finally, at the end of the tale, they reached the promised land, the new place. A literature professor by the name of William Bridges, some years ago, was rereading this tale and many other tales from literature about change. And he went back and he found the first modern work of anthropology called, I can't pronounce the French, I'm sorry, but Rites of Passage. The first modern work of anthropology talked about indigenous peoples and the rituals they had to take young people from childhood to adulthood. And what he observed in all these rituals was that they first ritualized loss. And they went through that. Then they ritualized confusion, creativity, but a lack of direction. And then they ritualized the new place. Bridges developed from this what became a best-selling book and now a whole profession of organizational development, consultants, people like me, arguing that with change, when change occurs, there is a predictable process that we go through in the emotional and psychological response. And that is, looking here, the first phase is one of fantasy, it's going to be great, or denial, it isn't really going to change. That's the first phase. So this is the Israelites when they're back in Egypt saying, if we could only get out of Egypt. And it's also you when you had gotten your acceptance to law school. With everyone around you, what did the people around you say when you got your acceptance letter to Vanderbilt and you decided to come to Vanderbilt Law School? What were the reactions of people around you? Congratulations. What else? Yeah. Come on in. Part of the reason that no one wants to hear you complain is because most people think you're pretty lucky. And probably when you got that acceptance letter, you were thinking the same thing. This is going to be great. Well, as I understand the process of change, you're down in this gray zone, which is fantasy, imagining that you could be picked up from Iowa or Dallas, wherever you were in undergraduate school, dropped in law school, and you would not experience jet lag. You were going to fly from Nashville to New Zealand. You were going to wake up in the morning, and it was going to be just fine. Well, it turns out that when you fly from Nashville, anybody flown as far as New Zealand? Okay, what happened?
I didn't know what time it was for the longest time. It was a 16-hour flight, I believe, from LA home.
Yeah. And what were some of the things that went on with you, with your physical reactions when you got to New Zealand?
We were just really tired. We just tried our best to stay up until that night so we could get on the right sleeping schedule. But it was a tough first day.
Anybody else have a jet lag experience that you can recount for us where you've gone even to Europe or Africa? I went to China, and I can tell you it took several days. The doctors tell us that we have about a dozen circadian rhythms in our body that control digestion, waking up, and that sort of thing. And that what jet lag is that our internal, those circadian rhythms don't adjust at the same speed. So that terrible feeling of jet lag is that your eyes are in New Zealand and your bowels are in Washington, D.C. or L.A., right? And your sense of when you're supposed to wake up, they're disconnected. Bridges' theory is that when we go through change, such as going from your undergraduate school to law school, or from being in the middle of law school to suddenly you're in the third year and you know the change is coming, that we go through an internal process of psychological adjustment. And that in fact the Exodus story can be understood as a story to describe that inner psychological process. Because we start with denial or fantasy, this is going to be great. Then we're across the Red Sea and we become aware of losses. What I want you to do is flip over to the second page of your sheet here. What I want you to do is look at this sheet, and I've got 4 boxes, and what I want you to just think about is, what are the changes that have occurred in your life just in the since January 1 of this year? So a geographic change would be that you moved from Washington, D.C. to Nashville, or that you moved from one house to another house or apartment. A change in professional status would be, let's say you were working before you came to law school, so you went from being employed to student. A change in personal relationships might be you've had a changed relationship with a partner, significant other, child, or maybe some very close and intimate friends. And the 4th box, group memberships, would be, let's say you were a member of a concert choir in undergraduate school, or a gospel chorus, or a church, where you were really involved, and you have lost that group membership as a result, in this year, as a result of coming to law school. So just fill in the box of the changes that are happening in your life since the 1st of this year. As you start filling this in, one of the things that I think, if you're like most of the first years or the second years or the third years, you recognize that you're filling up these boxes with some significant life changes. Important relationships that you depended on have been disrupted. Familiar places where you live have been lost. And the loss of status from being at the head of the class in your undergraduate school to fighting for survival in law school is a big change for most of us. And then just when you think that you've finally got this law school thing down and know how to study and meet your professor's expectations, you're looking at this cliff you're about to go over, which is called leaving law school and entering work. Take the next page. You can look back at these if you want later. And just look at this next box, which is, how am I reacting to these changes? Bridges' work suggests that when we go through a change, there are losses, and that we have responses to those losses, which can be physical, such as sleeplessness, or lassitude, like you spoke of when you flew to New Zealand. They can be emotional, feelings of anger, fear, self-doubt. They can turn up in our relationships, where we become short with our spouse or significant other, our roommates we're biting at, or we are withdrawing from people that we've relied on in the past. And then there's a spiritual reaction to these changes, which can involve feeling lost, worthless, and unloved, unvalued. So those are just some of the, so just sketch in your notes about how you are reacting to these changes. The most important single thing that I have to share with you this morning from the world of work that I've been doing is that when we go through change, even a good change, we're going to have to experience loss. Loss brings with it anger, fear, resentment. And we're going to have to endure ambiguity. Because once the familiar has been taken away, restraints, ways of being, ways of acting, familiar structures that ordered our life are taken away. And that produces anxiety. It's like the world is open to you, but where am I supposed to go? So your body has arrived in law school, but the inside process of emotional and psychological adjustment has not yet occurred. When I first moved to Nashville, I once in the first week tried to go from my house to get a loaf of bread and get back home. I left my house 5 times before I finally got back with a loaf of bread. The first time, I forgot what I was going for and went to a different place. The second time, I got lost. The story, you've got to understand, is only 7 or 8 blocks from my house. I got lost and couldn't find my way. The third time, I got distracted and went to, it took me 5 times. That's the neutral zone. William Bridges, this literature professor turned organizational development consultant, he argues that if you look at my graphic here, that the first phase, and these are phases, not stages. Those of you that are familiar, you either have children or you have children in your extended family. The terrible twos don't start one day with the flip of a switch and end one day when the child wakes up and is delightful. The terrible twos are a phase that kids go into and out of, and there's a period when it seems like it will never end, and they're like that every day. Well, this is the same. Thing. Let me see if I can get my this little doodad to work here. Where's the pen? Somewhere. Usually a pen. On top. Voila. Perfect. Thank you. Somebody knew. Now what we need to do is to find where on this screen it lets me use it. See if I can turn it. Oh, there it is. Just a second. I think. No, that's Smartboard. I know what we'll do. Here we go. Let's just go Insert. And then we'll go to Hello, Insert. And see if this will let me do this. What happens to us is that we go through, no, that's not going to work, so just ignore that. When I did training for a group of young people out in Oakland recently, and they wanted to rename these categories. Bridges calls them the endings, the neutral zone, the new beginning. I've added, as you can see, a 5th up there. You can't quite read it, which is reminiscing. You know you're to the reminiscing phase when you can describe the way the change affected you. It no longer carries an emotional charge. When you can retell the experience of the change without reliving it, you've arrived at a new place. All of us have a story about a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a parent, a friend, a job, a relationship, where the change really had a powerful effect on us. And eventually we reach a time we can tell that story and laugh, and find the humor in it without it reanimating all those feelings. That's the reminiscing phase. So that the Bridges hypothesis is that as we go through these changes, that in-between phase, the neutral zone, have any of you had a friend who was in a really bad relationship that they finally got out of? And can you remember what it was like when it seemed like they just didn't see it? Get it? Okay, that's the denial phase. And then there's a time when something happens and they know and you know that there's no going back. That's the endings phase. And do you remember how crushed confused, angry they were, and how they did not want to hear you say, "I told you so." That's the endings. And then there's like the conversations, "I'm never going to have another boyfriend again. I'm never going to have another relationship. I don't know how to do this," right? That's the neutral zone. The young people in Oakland that I trained called this the Fishbowl Stage. I said, "Why do you call it that?" They said, "You're swimming around in circles and everybody can see you." The tendency, and only slowly, then that friend comes and reports to you that she had a date with a guy or a young man, young woman, and they had a date where they didn't talk about their ex. That's the beginning of the new beginning. And then eventually they can tell the story of how they broke up and laugh about it. That's the reminiscing phase. Coming to law school is a change, and that it requires us to go through these phases because there are significant losses involved in coming to law school. Losses of status, losses of time, losses of familiar routines, losses of where you lived, roommates, friends. All of those generate anger and resentment. Not knowing where they're coming from, we tend to attribute meaning to them. So we think the roommate is really irritating us. We think that the spouse or significant other is really just playing that music that way to, out of complete insensitivity to our feelings and responses. But actually, you have to, Bridges says, and it's been my experience, you've got to live through the loss and live with the ambiguity. How many of you have had a friend who broke off that bad relationship and the anxiety of the neutral zone was so intense? What did they do? They went back, found that same boyfriend or girlfriend with a different name. And this is what we often do when we enter these experiences, is we retreat back to something familiar instead of recognizing the opportunity for the creativity that exists in the neutral zone. But there is tremendous opportunity for creativity in the neutral zone. So people's response to the loss to the emotions associated with loss tends to be withdrawal. So they withdraw from friends, they withdraw from relationships, they go back inside themselves, they start doing nothing but working, they're no longer going out, they're no longer going to the movies, they're no longer engaging in things, they're not exercising. They're not doing the things that they did before to nourish and care for themselves, because what they're doing is responding to the losses by withdrawal. It's pretty common for folks to respond to those losses with alcohol or with drugs as a way to deal with anger, fear, resentment. And there are lots of other sort of standard responses that people have. The neutral zone and its ambiguity causes people to often have a sense of a loss of purpose. What am I doing here? And then they start to engage in self-sabotage. For example, when I was in law school, I developed an enormous fascination with foosball. And so when I was really in a lost place, I would go over to the rec center and play foosball for hours at a time. Now, I felt like shit, if you'll the technical phrase, when I got back and realized that I had not done my studies. But that was my response to that liminal phase of this neutral zone where, what am I doing? How do I do it? I don't feel like I belong here. And so, and the feelings of loss, I withdrew, and then I went back to something familiar because foosball was also one of the ways I got through undergraduate school. Now, luckily, I'd been a debater in college, and I got a job coaching the high school debate team and the college debate team, and so that soaked up a lot of the time where I was living in perpetual anxiety. But, you know, I got a courtesy pass in property, I'm convinced, in as much as I did not attend one class in the second semester property. I still don't know why they gave me a C+. So we can respond to these with really self-sabotaging behavior because we're experiencing loss and anxiety and confusion that we think is unique to us. that there's something wrong with us that we are experiencing these feelings of loss and anxiety. And so not having a name to put on them, not having a place to put them, must be that I'm in the wrong place. It must be that I'm not as smart as my friends, or if I'm as smart, I'm not as disciplined. I must be in the wrong place. Or I will work 18 hours a day and I will not go out for coffee. I will not say hello to one of my old friends on the telephone, and that's the way I'm going to escape this neutral zone and its anxiety. So how do you, what are ideas of dealing with this? Well, let's just think about this. I want you to reflect back on, you've all been through changes like this. You've been through changes in relationships. You've been through moves. You were saying you've lived in 5 different places. What are some of the ways that you guys have cared for yourself in the past when you had to go through a change and you were experiencing these feelings of loss and anger? So maybe anger toward your parents, they made you move again, and feelings of confusion about where you are and where you belong. What are some of the ways that things that you've used or that you've encouraged friends? By the way, I've discovered it's vastly easier for me to advise other people on how to manage transitions than it is for me to manage transitions in my own life. It's just one of those odd little things. So it's okay to say, well, this is what I've told my friends to do. What are some of the ways that you engage in self-care when you are going through the response to a transition? Get enough sleep. Boy, that's a big one, isn't it? Get enough sleep. Sleep deprivation will put you in some weird places. If you're not getting enough sleep, that's a clue that you may be on transitions overload. And that you're reverting back to old behavior, which was cramming, which you did in undergraduate school, but you're doing it every night. So that's a very common way to respond to the fear and the anxiety of the losses. What are other ways that you engage in self-care when you're going through transitions? Yeah?
Getting on a schedule so that I can make sure I have some fun time, so
The structuring, see, what do losses take away? Losses take away structure. So what you're reporting here is that by creating a schedule for yourself, you're creating what the change has taken away, which is structure. And so you're rebuilding a structure that returns the sense of, I can manage this, I'm in some reasonable level of control, my life isn't. And it helps to manage down the anxiety that comes with the neutral zone. That's a really good way of self-care. What are some others? Try to get exercise. Exercise is one of the first things to go, and when you're feeling down about yourself, you see the anger and the fear. When if some guy's dumped us, we can project all that anger onto him. But nobody made you come to law school. You were the ones who came to law school, right? Can't put that anywhere else. And so what we do is we tend to start focusing on the worst, weakest parts about ourselves. And I don't believe there's anybody in this room who's perfect. My guess is that if I knew you well enough, I could point out a flaw or two. And so we start then to obsess and focus in on those flaws. So that that's where the exercise comes in. Is it something there's an old line from Alcoholics Anonymous that says, fake it till you can make it. So one of the best ways to deal with loss and ambiguity is to say, how would I be behaving if I were on top of the world? Well, one of the things I'd be doing when I'm on top of the world is I exercise. So go out and fake it till you can make it. Go out and find something that you did when you were on top of the world. Did you go to the movies every Friday night? Did you call a friend, an old friend, once a week? What was it you were doing when you were on top of the world? Go out and physically do that. The body will actually contain muscle memory that will help to bring back a state of mind that's more a sense of being in control. No one does all of these. These are just ideas. What are some other ways of self-care when you are that you can think of from the past when you were in perhaps the grips of a response to a transition in your life?
Trying to recognize self-sabotaging behavior, I think, is an important part of it. A lot of people, myself included, have a history of self-sabotage. And so when you go home and you say, I'm going to watch this one movie, you know that what the movie means. It means you're not going to read for the rest of the night. You're not going to start until midnight or whatever. You know what it means when you say, I'm going to take an hour break or sleep for 5 more minutes. It means you're not going to wake up until 10 minutes before class. So recognizing that sort of pattern of behavior and then taking steps to consciously avoid it is something that I'm trying to work into.
It's good to know that the problems that I had as a law student are not entirely missing in the new class. One of the things we do, at least I do, when I'm caught up in these responses, is to withdraw from other relationships. And that's why a study group has the effect of introducing something into your schedule. I found that when Eric Manorfield and I were studying for antitrust, that he was a really good student, and I was embarrassed to come and sit down 15 minutes before class without having read it. So it was just a little trick, but it also brought me into relationship with other people at a time when all the feelings I was experiencing made me want to withdraw, because I was feeling down, angry, resentful. I wasn't feeling particularly an attractive conversation partner with other people. And I would tend to run toward relationships with the other sex, even just the flirt, date stuff, because at least there was going to be some relationship there, but it wasn't actually helping me get to where I wanted to get. So the study group is a way of coping both with self-sabotage, but with all these things, labeling them as to what they are, it can be a huge step in the right direction, and also recognizing that you're not the only one that's going through it can help with the part where we tend to say we are especially labelable as compared to others, and undermines our sense of what are other ways in the past that you've one of the things that Bridges talks about is if you're going through some significant change, like in career, don't introduce other changes at the same time if you don't have to. So this is not a good time, for example, to change from Word 2003 to Word 2007. This is not a good time to go from a Mac, from a PC to a Mac, right? Now, but we do that because, now why do we do it? We want that feeling of having dealt with a change successfully, that mastery feeling, right? Plus, what a great time sink. Let's get another apartment, right? Then I'll have to go out and because I don't like my roommate. I've always been in places by myself. I think I should get an apartment by myself. Now, if I get an apartment by myself, what will I have to do? I have to go out and shop for utensils. Great, there's an afternoon. Then I'll have to go to Target and, the sheets I've got are not going to match. Okay, definitely going to, and I'm going to have to invite my friends over to help me paint. We're going to have a great party. This is great. Of course, the problem is if you go to a new place, what are you going to experience? Loss, ambiguity before you arrive at the new beginning of waking up in the morning and knowing whether you're supposed to turn right or left. So what we've done is added another layer, because the problem is we're all on transitions overload. So adding every change that we add brings with it loss, ambiguity before you get to the new beginning. You have to go through it. Even if you know it's going to happen, loss, ambiguity, you're going to have to go through it. So one of the things to do is when you're in the middle of major change, if you have something you're thinking about changing, want to do a wardrobe changeover, not this month, right? And the other thing that tends to happen is major relationships break up when you come to law school or when you take the first job. And part of what's going on is that whatever the natural strain in that relationship is, it's going to be exacerbated by the feelings of loss, ambiguity that you're going to go through. And you start, both of you, projecting stuff onto each other that you think because you don't have a place to put it. Why am I feeling this way? It must be he's just two kinds of a jerk and I thought he was a nice person. And what we're living through is actually projecting onto someone else feelings from inside ourselves that are coming from the experience of loss and ambiguity that we're going through. The other is to remind ourselves what is changing and what is not. Your name isn't changing. Your fundamental identity is not changing because you've gone from being a star student to a scrub law student, or from, better still, a job where people looked up to you, to a room where nobody knows who you are. You have not. So to remind ourselves about what's changing and what's not. If you've had groups that you were connected to earlier in your life, churches, singing groups, sports groups, some friend group, going and not giving yourself the excuse I'm too busy, going and recognizing that, going and refinding that, not the exact group, but a group that addresses this need in your life. Really important way of self-care, because you're building a group that is something other than just going to evaluate you by how well you did on contracts. So that's, but like being clear about what's changing, what's not. And then we all deal differently. Have any of you taken Myers-Briggs? The Myers-Briggs, so you sort of know what you are, right? If you're a J, the Js do well by coming up with a specific, detailed plan of how they're going to respond to the changes. If you're a P, like myself, you need to be reminded of what your purpose is. You need to go back and write notes to yourself, remind yourself, engage in conversation with someone that's reminding you of your purpose. What's your purpose here? And what's the plan? The purpose and the plan are really good ways of coping with the emotional responses to change. And the other thing is, you can take this little graphic that I've given you, take it and write down at the bottom of it, take that thing, write down at the bottom of it one of the significant changes that you're going through. Okay? Just one. And then use the numbers at the bottom to be once a week or once a day if it's something that you're going through very intensely. Let's say once a week. Pull up this graphic and draw a little bar. So here's what it will look like after you've been doing it for a while. What is this week mostly like in relationship to this change? Has it mostly been a time when I'm really feeling the anger, the sadness from loss? Or is it mostly confusion and anxiety? That's the neutral zone. Or am I starting to feel, I got a little bit of a glimpse of I thought I was really on solid ground. I had a whole night when I studied all night. I called my friend, got up the next morning, I was ready for torts, and I was cruise control for 2 days, and then I went back to the movies, right? So that's new beginning back to, so that would be if you're looking on this graphic. See, here's where I was when I had days where I went all the way after I'd moved here, where it felt like I was in the new beginning within the same week, all the way back down to re-experiencing loss, all in the same week. There were other times when it was just mainly confusion. And eventually, my days started to be more beginning and less neutral zone. So take some change that's affecting you, sort of to try to begin to think how this might be useful to you. Pick one change. If it's a big relationship change you're going through, if it's just the experience of coming to law school. Write that at the bottom, and then chart yourself maybe once a week. Where am I mostly? What's going on here mostly? And one of the reasons for doing this is to help you realize, oh, this actually does feel different than it felt. As crappy as it feels, as confused as I am, this isn't the same as it was 3 weeks ago when I was crying myself to sleep every night and not telling anybody about it. And then eventually you'll be able to look back and see, oh, actually, that was different in the past. Not always progressive. Sometimes you are going to go, you're going to think, I'm at the new beginning, hallelujah, I'm here, all that's behind me, and then you're going to hit a trigger, and it's all the way back. These are not really distinct stages. so much as there are things that are present. And the worst part is we're all dealing with multiple changes at once. So the change of teaching a new course for me, I'm in the ambiguity. The change of the house, I've got that one down, I'm in the new beginning. And they're happening at the same time and really making it even more confusing. So that's the story about transitions and change. And if any of you, if this rings a bell with you and want to read more, you can find William Bridges, his introductory book on making sense of change is a terrific way to find out more about it. So thanks for spending the time together. Are there any questions back there that anybody has? Okay. I have to remember that if I'm going to use the little writing pen, that you've got to activate the program to do it. Yeah, no, I use it in my class, so I know to do that, but you have to actually activate the writing pen.
Or did you want some of these handouts?
Sure. Yep. Why don't you take half of them and I'll take the other half. And then what we might do is to if you want to post it and say that if anybody wants the handouts, they can come pick them up. Good. Okay, good. You're welcome. Yep. Oh, wait a minute. He's going to want his microphone back.
Actually,